by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1. The Mourning Tide. The morning air felt heavy as Evelyn Hart stood on the edge of the crumbling coast of her childhood home in Maine. The relentless ocean roared onto the shore, each wave stealing more land with a cruel inevitability. It was a painful irony that the warnings she had dedicated her life to studying were now a terrifying reality.
Evelyn brushed wind-tousled hair from her eyes and watched as people loaded their belongings onto trucks bound for higher ground. Her own family was waiting just inland, her husband John and their teenage daughter Mia already packed, ready to flee what had once been a sanctuary.
Evelyn had grown up with the Atlantic, its vastness as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. It was here she first learned to measure the tides, capture weather patterns, and envision a future that many had scoffed at. Her thoughts drifted back to meetings in sterile conference rooms, her voice rising above the clamor as she pleaded for change. Back then, they had called her a Cassandra, a prophet of doom. They hadn't listened. Now, with the water licking at their feet, they had no choice.
Evelyn clenched her jaw and turned away from the sea, heading back to the ridge where John was waiting in their old, worn truck.
"It's time to go," he said, closing the back of the vehicle with a weary sigh.
He had dark circles under his eyes, the kind that months of broken sleep and anxiety carved into a man's face. Mia was in the passenger seat, headphones clamped over her ears in a futile attempt to drown out the chaos. She barely acknowledged her mother's arrival.
Evelyn settled into the back, peering out at the shuddering horizon as they began their journey inland. In the rearview mirror, the ocean engulfed their street.
It was a sight she knew would haunt her dreams. Chapter 2. Venice Adrift.
Marco stood knee-deep in the murky waters of St. Mark's Square, watching as the stones of his beloved city disappeared beneath a shimmering expanse. Venice had always lived with water, but never like this. The sight sent an ache deep into the pit of his stomach.
The square, once bustling with tourists, was now filled with city workers and volunteers, all scrambling to fortify the vulnerable alleys and ancient buildings with sandbags and temporary barriers. The air smelled of salt, damp stone, and something else, an undercurrent of desperation. As an urban planner, Marco had spent years designing solutions to keep Venice afloat. The rising sea levels, however, were proving to be a foe beyond his control. International aid had arrived. The city had launched ambitious floating infrastructure projects. Yet, time was slipping away faster than they could adapt. For every solution, nature seemed to offer a harsher rebuttal. Venice was drifting further from its past, like a dream whispered on the wind.
He walked briskly to the edge of the square, where a group of engineers huddled over blueprints, debating the next set of tidal barriers. Among them was Sophia, a civil engineer who had become his closest ally in the fight to save their city. "We need more time," Marco said, his voice low but firm.
Sophia offered a tight nod of acknowledgement. "We need a miracle."
Marco almost smiled. Even in the midst of despair, Sophia's relentless optimism had a way of keeping him grounded. As the sun dipped low over the city, painting the sky with streaks of orange and crimson, Marco allowed himself a moment of stillness. The waters reflected the colors of the setting sun, turning Venice into a watercolor dream. Fragile, fleeting, but still breathtaking. Venice was still beautiful, still magical.
And Marco vowed he would not let it drown.
Chapter 3. Waves in the Maldives.
Amina stood at the forefront of a gathering on the beach, her bare feet sinking into the warm sand as she faced the restless ocean. The Maldives, once a paradise of dazzling turquoise waters and endless white shores, now felt like a ghost of itself. The lavish resorts that had once welcomed tourists from around the world stood empty, their overwater bungalows abandoned, half submerged in the creeping tide.
She lifted a megaphone to her lips.
"We cannot wait for the world to decide if we matter," she called out. "We must fight for our home."
The crowd erupted in cheers, but behind their fervor, Amina saw the exhaustion in their eyes. They were tired of fighting an enemy they couldn't touch, tired of waiting for leaders in distant cities to send help that never came fast enough. At just 22, Amina had become the face of resistance, rallying her people to build floating gardens, reinforce sea barriers, and reclaim what the ocean tried to steal. She had given speeches to world leaders, pleaded with the United Nations, and yet aid trickled in too slowly. Debates over the Maldives' survival unfolded in distant conference rooms, where the fate of her homeland was reduced to talking points and budgetary concerns.
Near the shoreline, she spotted Faisal, an old fisherman who had spent his entire life navigating these waters. His face, weathered by years of sun and salt, bore a quiet grief. "We can't let it end like this," she murmured, standing beside him.
Fazal nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We won't."
The rally ended as the sun dipped below the waves, casting an eerie glow over the waters that threatened to consume their island. As the crowd dispersed, Amina remained, staring at the sea. She had spent her entire life believing in the strength of her people, in their ability to adapt, to endure. But as the waves lapped hungrily at the shore, she wondered how much longer they had before the ocean finally won. Chapter 4: Engineering Hope. In the heart of New York City, where towering skyscrapers reached for the heavens, Tom leaned over his desk, eyes scanning the blueprints sprawled before him. The room was cluttered, half-empty coffee cups, stacks of reports, glowing monitors displaying simulations of rising waters. His office felt more like a war room, where he waged a battle against a tide that refused to retreat. Tom was an engineer, but more than that, he was a man haunted by loss. The first great flood had taken everything from him: his parents, his childhood home, the life he had once known. Since then, he had dedicated himself to designing a future where no one else had to suffer the same fate. His solution: floating habitats, structures that could rise with the water instead of being swallowed by it. His phone buzzed, a message from his sister, Lily.
"Did you eat today?"
Tom sighed, rubbing his temples before typing a quick reply.
"Later."
Lily worried about him. She had every reason to. His work had consumed him, and even now, as the city outside hummed with life, he barely noticed. His focus remained on the screen, where his latest prototype, a modular floating city, was running through its final simulations. If successful, these structures could be deployed worldwide, offering refuge to those displaced by the rising seas. A knock at his door. His lead architect, Priya, stepped in, holding a tablet.
"The new materials test came back positive. We're ready for the first full-scale model."
Tom exhaled. "Then let's build it."
As dusk settled over the skyline, he stepped out onto the balcony, staring at the East River. The water shimmered under the city lights, a quiet reminder of the force he fought against every day. But for the first time in years, Tom felt something stir inside him. Hope. Chapter 5: A Fragmented World.
Marco stood on what remained of the Rialto Bridge, his gaze sweeping over the half-submerged city of Venice. The waters had not won, not yet, but the city had been forced to change, to adapt. Modular infrastructure now threaded through its ancient foundations, canals lined with new floating walkways, buildings reinforced with cutting-edge hydro barriers. Venice was no longer simply a relic of the past. It had become a blueprint for the future.
Yet Marco's heart remained heavy. He had spent years fighting for this city, pouring every ounce of his expertise into its survival. And still, he knew that for every solution they found, there were a dozen cities that would not be so lucky.
Beside him, Sophia leaned against the railing, watching a group of volunteers stacking sandbags. "We did what we could," she said softly.
Marco exclaimed. "I know, I just wish it were enough."
Beyond Venice, the world was fracturing. As coastal cities struggled to stay afloat, new alliances were forming, communities of displaced people banding together, forging new identities in the face of loss. Marco had seen it firsthand. At a makeshift planning station, he met a young artist from Naples and an engineer from Lisbon. They were sketching ideas for a floating cultural hub, something that would preserve not just architecture, but the spirit of the cities that were disappearing. Striking a balance between heritage and innovation was the greatest challenge. But what choice did they have? That night, as he walked through the city, he heard music drifting through the air, Venetians gathering in the square, singing, laughing, refusing to surrender to despair. Perhaps, he thought, adaptation wasn't just about survival. Perhaps it was about finding new ways to thrive. Venice would endure, and so would they. Chapter 6: Mirage of Hope.
The wind carried the scent of salt and decay as Amina stood on the highest point of her island, staring at the encroaching tide. The Maldives had always been fragile, a paradise floating on borrowed time, but now the ocean was taking more than it ever had before.
Families were leaving. Every day, more boats set sail for distant shores. their passengers carrying only what they could. Those who stayed fought with whatever tools they had: sandbags, coral restoration projects, floating gardens. But against the rising seas, it felt like patching a sinking ship with hope alone.
Amina refused to leave. She refused to let her home be swallowed.
At the center of the island, her small workshop buzzed with energy. Volunteers gathered around blueprints, their hands stained with salt and soil as they built floating homes, modern takes on the traditional dhoni boats, crafted to survive the tides. Engineers from across the world had come to help, drawn by the impossible challenge of saving a drowning nation. And then, a breakthrough. An environmental scientist arrived with an idea: coral nurseries designed to grow at accelerated rates, forming natural barriers against erosion. If successful, the reefs could slow the sea's advance, giving them time.
Amina watched as the first coral structures were lowered into the ocean, their bright artificial frameworks blending with the remnants of the old reef. If these took root, if they flourished, they could save not just the Maldives, but countless other vulnerable islands.
That night, the community gathered under the stars: fishermen, builders, children, everyone who had chosen to stay. They sang old songs, voices rising above the waves, a reminder that they were still here, that they would not disappear quietly.
You will not take us without a fight.
Chapter 7, The Floating Dream. Tom stood on the deck of his latest creation, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the water. Beneath him, the floating city bobbed gently with the tide, a network of modular, self-sustaining homes tethered together in New York Harbor. This was more than just a project. This was proof. For years he had battled bureaucracy, fought against disbelief, pushed forward when even his own colleagues doubted him. But now, as the first families moved into their floating homes, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Vindication. The structures weren't just functional, they were beautiful. Vertical gardens lined the walkways, solar panels gleamed in the last light of the day, and beneath the surface, algae farms thrived, providing both food and natural filtration for the water around them. He had built this city for those displaced by the rising seas. But now, it was becoming something more: an experiment in how humanity could live with water instead of fighting against it. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts.
You did it?
Lily said, stepping up beside him.
Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. We did it.
Below them, families unpacked their belongings, children ran across the floating platforms, and the hum of life filled the air. It was the beginning of something new. A city unanchored yet steady, a sanctuary in an uncertain world. As night settled over the harbor, Tom looked out at the water, no longer seeing it as an enemy. For the first time in years, he saw possibility. Chapter 8, Shores of Tomorrow. Storms battered the coastlines with relentless fury, reshaping the world with every crashing wave. Evelyn had spent her life predicting this moment, yet even she had underestimated how quickly the planet would transform. She stood at the edge of another relocation camp, watching families arrive, some from Maine, some from Louisiana, others from places that no longer existed on the maps. They carried their lives in suitcases, their faces etched with the quiet resignation of those who had run out of places to run. She knew the pattern well. First came the floods, then the temporary shelters, then, if they were lucky, resettlement into cities farther inland, ones with infrastructure sturdy enough to absorb the influx of climate refugees. But the world was running out of safe ground.
Evelyn wiped the rain from her face as she made her way into a tent where engineers, architects, and policymakers huddled over maps, debating the future. She had spent decades warning people to act before it was too late. Now her work had shifted from prevention to survival.
Across the room, a young researcher caught her eye. He was sketching something, a city unlike any she had seen before. A floating metropolis, not just of homes, but of entire industries, schools, farms. A civilization built to drift with the tides rather than be swallowed by them. Evelyn felt something stir in her chest.
Could it be possible? Could humanity not only endure, but thrive in a world remade by the ocean?
She sat beside him, studying the plans.
Tell me more.
As the storm raged outside, Evelyn found herself daring to hope. Chapter 9, Light of the New World. The conference pavilion stood against a backdrop of lush greenery and shimmering water, an architectural marvel designed for a world in transition. It wasn't built in a city or on solid ground, but on a floating platform, one of many now dotting the coastlines of nations adapting to their new reality.
Evelyn stepped onto the stage, the weight of years pressing against her shoulders. She had spoken in many places like this before, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't just issuing warnings. She was standing before a room filled with leaders, engineers, and visionaries who were finally ready to act.
She scanned the crowd and saw familiar faces. Amina, fresh from the Maldives, her hands still stained with the coral she and her people had planted to save their home. Marco, whose fight for Venice had turned it into a global model for floating infrastructure. Tom, who had built an entire city upon the water, proving that humanity could survive without land beneath its feet. This wasn't a meeting of despair, it was a gathering of resilience. Evelyn adjusted the microphone and began.
For centuries, we built our civilizations with the belief that land was permanent, that oceans were borders rather than homes. We were wrong, but today we stand on the edge of a new era, not one of loss, but of adaptation. A new world is rising, not from the ashes, but from the waves.
The room was silent, absorbing her words.
In Venice, they have found ways to weave the past into the future, proving that heritage and innovation can coexist. In the Maldives, the people are reclaiming their islands, showing that nature can be a partner in survival. And here in these floating cities, we see what is possible when we stop resisting change and start working with it.
She looked at them, her voice steady.
This is not the end of our world. It is the beginning of a new one.
Applause erupted, not hesitant, not polite, but real. As Evelyn stepped away from the podium, Amina reached for her hand. Marco clapped her on the back. Tom gave her a nod, the quiet approval of a man who had spent too many years fighting for people to listen. The world had changed, and finally humanity was changing with it.